Okay, I want to thank everybody for tuning into this program. So what I'm doing is I'm just going to be on cruise control for a couple of weeks. I got another debate coming up next month, so I'm try to do a few of these. I might try to get in another discussion. And what I did last week was I did a study on Cain and Abel. It was on Genesis chapter 4, and I talked about how man was evicted from the garden. And then, of course, there was a way of reentrance, or at least a way of gaining favor with God through the means of a sacrifice. And then I showed how the two seeds um, develop from the time that Adam is evicted from the garden. So, whereas mankind was originally one, male and female, from the time of the eviction, you find two seeds start to develop and make their appearance. And so you have the seed of the woman, seed of the serpent. They're both locked in a perpetual enmity. And this motif gets carried forward through the Old Testament into the New Testament, where in the first century you find it being played out in the Gospels with Jesus Christ. You know, when he comes on the scene, and of course he's the seed of the woman, and then of course he's facing off against the seed of the serpent. And then you have this catharsis, you have this period of persecution where of course Jesus Christ is slain. He's slain by his brother, just as Abel was slain by Cain. He rises from the dead. He leaves earth to go back to heaven. And of course, he's waiting for them to repent. He's waiting for them to accept the offer of the kingdom, because this was all very germane to Israel's kingdom program. The kingdom program, if you look very carefully in the Old Testament, the kingdom program, what the kingdom program is all about, is it's about restoring the dominion in the earth that Adam lost. And if you look back through the Old Testament prophetic text, you'll find that the kingdom program, some of the more salient facets of the kingdom program are, number one, the regathering of the nation of Israel. Number two, punishment upon the Gentile oppressors. So not only the Gentile oppressors, but judgment of all of the nations. Number three, there's also in some of the minor prophets, particularly there's a concept of Israel, the remnant that is left of Israel, of partaking of actually fighting the last battle against the nations. So we can go through some of those another time, but this motif of the two seeds is really, I think it's something that a lot of people miss. And because they see it going through the Old Testament, but they don't trace it back to its proper source, they're going to miss a lot of the meat. But I have actually, a sermon by John Lightfoot, who was one of the great Hebrew scholars, and he was really probably one of the better theologians of the post-Reformation period. Now, he wrote a very little-known sermon called "The Faith of Adam," and that's what I'm going to be kind of piggybacking off of tonight. It's really a great sermon because what it does, it talks about this concept of faith, of Adam having faith, and what actually happened in the garden. Was it just was it some allegorical sort of story that we're to look at and just say, well, that was kind of a myth, or that was just kind of their legend, their as they call it in critical circles, their ideological way of explaining reality? Or was it something that has a lot of truth to it, something that we can build on, and that we can build our understanding of sin, man's alienation from God, and of course, what he needs to do to get back to God, and ultimately man's salvation? Can we build on the concepts that are being laid out for us in Genesis 3? So let me just go through some of this, and what I'll do is I'll do like I did in my last lesson. I will just give some brief commentary as I go along. So this was actually very difficult for me to find. I do have this particular sermon. It's in a volume called Whole Works of John Lightfoot. I think it's volume number 7, but it's not available for download online, so I had to really look. So this is an older edition. This is from the 1600s. And so he starts off, he says that he's sensible in the text. So the text that he's giving is Genesis chapter 3:20. And Adam called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. So you remember what happened was they were in the garden. They were told not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. they ate, they they sinned, and somehow the sin got incorporated into man's nature. And that I think is brought out with this concept of, ingestion, ingesting, eating the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, made good and evil become like assimilated into human nature and experience. There's a lot of depth to that idea. And so they were in the garden, and of course the Nakash, or the serpent, as it's translated in English, says the Nakash is. I'm going back to Genesis 3, verse 1. And the Nakash was more arum than any beast of the Sade which Hashem Elohim had made. So he says he's more cunning, more crafty than any beast of the field which God had made. And he said unto the Isha, really? Hath Elohim said, ye shall not eat of kol etz hagan, of every tree of the garden? And the Isha said unto the Nakash, we may eat of the pri etz hagan, but of the pri ha'etz, which is in the middle of the gan, or garden, Elohim hath said, ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. And then Nakash said unto the Isha, ye shall surely not die, for Elohim doth know that in the yom ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be like Elohim, knowing tov and ra, good and evil. And when the Isha saw that ha'etz was tov for food, and that it was delight to the eyes, and ha'etz to be coveted to make one have cycle, or wisdom, she took of the peri thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her Ish with her, and he did eat. The eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were arumim, naked ones. And then they sewed, of course, the fig leaves together, making themselves loin-covering girdles. And they heard the call, or voice, of Hashem Elohim walking in the gan in the cool of the day. And Ha'adam and his Isha hid from the presence of Hashem Elohim among the Etz Hagan. And Hashem Elohim called unto Ha'adam and said unto him, where art thou? And he said, I heard thy voice in the gan, and I was afraid, because I was arum, and so I hid. And so the story goes on, and of course, there's a punishment. There's a curse pronounced against the ground, not a curse pronounced against man, but against the ground, and of course, a curse pronounced against the serpent. So, curse pronounced against the serpent culminates in this pronouncement of warfare between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. And then, of course, he shall crush thy rosh, or head, and thou shalt strike his akev, heel. And so this is really the germ of the gospel. So man has fallen. He's yielded to Satan's wiles. He ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, from henceforth, good and evil becomes an integral part of human experience. So you have good, you have evil. You have day, you have night. This is something that goes back again, like I said last time, to Genesis. I believe Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, where, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then the earth became without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. So what happened at the beginning was that heaven and earth were one integral unit. They were in harmony. Then something happened. The earth became without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. So God begins his restorative work. But through his restorative work, he decides to take care of the earth first. And then, of course, the heavens, he creates the firmament. But the firmament actually shuts out shuts out the throne of God from the rest of the creation. So there's no longer this free access to the heavens that presumably existed before Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. And the story of the restoration of equilibrium between the heavens and the earth is actually charted all throughout the Old Testament and the New. So during the Old Testament times, the balance is more on the earthly side. So he's restoring earth, he's creating, he's giving it, vegetation, land, animals, etc. And then, of course, he's creating a temporary heavens in which he fixes the firmament, which he fixes the lights in the firmament, the stars, and all of that, to divide between the night and the day, and also provide light, and also for signs and for seasons and for such like. And so he's doing this restorative work. But again, the heavens are still shut out. Well, when we get to Revelation chapter 21 and 22, we find that this equilibrium was restored. But remember, it was on the earthly side. The balance was on the earthly side in the Old Testament. And then in the New Testament, all of a sudden it swings to the spiritual side. So now you're dealing with Hashomayim, the heavens, and not the Haaretz. You're dealing with two different concepts. You're dealing with, in the Old Testament, the balance was all on the side of Haaretz. And in the New Testament, the balance is all on the side of Hashomayim. So it's an interesting concept. And that's really going to probably be the subject when I write my next tract. That's probably going to be the subject that I'm going to be focusing on, is how this equilibrium gets restored. And it's, of course, described in the biblical narrative. But we understand that after the curse was pronounced against the serpent, and Christ was promised through the seed, as the seed of the woman who would crush the serpent's head, said that Adam called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. So Lightfoot says, he says this bravery so soon lost, so soon repaired, and so highly repaired to a better condition. So his notion is that Adam had sinned, but he was restored to a better condition through the gospel. He says that he is sensible of in the text. Therefore, he calls his wife's name Eve because mother of all living. He had named her, quod sexum, as to her sex. Now he gave her another name of distinction. Then she was called woman because she was taken out of man. Now Eve, because all living were to come out of her. Adam showed wisdom in naming the beasts. Here he shows that and more of his faith in sense of his better estate. She was rather the mother of death, having done that brought death into the world. But he, sensible of a better life to come in by her, calls her Eve, life, as the word signifies. So she was actually the mother of all the physical, of all who have physical life. But she's also the mother of Christ, through whom would come spiritual life. And then we have if you go back to Galatians, Paul says, the New Jerusalem above, that is the mother of us all. So I think that's the antitype. My personal hunch is that this is the antitype of Eve, because that's eventually, the New Jerusalem is eventually what gives birth to the man-child. And this curse that was placed upon man, if you want to call it a curse, because a lot of people think that it was a curse. They think, well, the ground was cursed, but man wasn't cursed. But supposing we take this as a curse, well, Eve was to bear children in sorrow, and she was to have birth pains and stuff. And so this is where the doctrine of the Great Tribulation, comes in, because remember, tribulation is the birth pains that are giving birth to the new creation, and then the children of the new creation, which in the case of the New Testament is going to be the new Israel. So the new Israel is going to inherit all of these promises ultimately, but the old Israel had to come first, and as a pattern sort of play out these types, so that we can see when we get to the New Testament, we can see that the new Israel is the one that's actually going to inherit all of these promises. So let's see. So Lightfoot goes on to say, in him was life, speaking of Christ, and life was the light of men. He was the mother of all living, viz. Of Christ and all that live by him. So his observation that he makes, that Lightfoot makes, is that Adam and Eve believed and obtained life. And so he gives some proof. Says, for the proof of this, let us view their story. God said, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Satan had accompanied with them till this promise came. He keeps to them to cheat them. Let's see, I don't have my glasses on. To cheer them. He persuaded them to hide themselves from the presence of the Lord. But now he sets him at defiance. She sees her error. The serpent says she deceived me, grows at enmity with him, having now a surer comfort promised to rely upon. So then God clothes them with skins. Now, this is a really important part of Genesis 3 is Genesis 3 chapter 3 verse 21. Because remember, God said that in the day that you eat thereof of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, in that day you shall surely die. Well, what's happening in chapter 3 verse 21 is that death penalty is actually falling on a substitute. So this is something like, if you miss this part and you say, well, they didn't die that day, therefore death must be spiritual, or therefore death must be, non-physical in nature. Therefore, we have to look for another definition, or for an accommodated definition of the penalty of death. That's where you're going to go off the rails. If you see, though, that what happened in the garden was, this is where the first sacrifice is slain. And this substitutionary sacrifice, it was the skins from this sacrifice that God used to clothe Adam and Eve. He clothed their nakedness with the skins of the slain beast. So he said, God clothed them with skins, which is an evidence that they sacrificed, for they had no need of slaying beasts for any other purpose. Flesh they might not eat. They were slain for sacrifice, and their skins served for clothing. Thus body and soul were provided for. And in these sacrifices, they looked after Christ and saw him in figure. The first death in the world was Christ dying in figure. Noah knew clean and unclean beasts and sacrificed. This undoubtedly he had learned from the beginning. So Adam must have taught his children sacrifice. He must have taught them that there is a way to get back to God. There is a way to have peace with God, and you have to present a substitute. You can't work out this for yourself, because remember, you have within you have this duality. You have this good and evil struggling, and ultimately the evils, as we learned from the Old Testament, ultimately the evil is going to master you. And that's really the history of the Old Testament. We see the faith principle being first inculcated in, well, you could go back to Enoch, of course, but especially in Abraham, where Abraham believed God and it was counted to him for righteousness. So now we have this faith principle here, where faith does actually get you someplace with God. Works won't, but faith will. But it's got to be faith in a sacrifice, in a substitute, in something that God has done that can justify you. And that's, for many years, I criticized Martin Luther, and I said, Martin Luther, he made a lot of stuff up, and he was cocky. He was a know-it-all, and the more I look at these types, though, I said, Luther had something. He had something with this, these. Now I don't know if he would agree with this, these types here and what Lightfoot's writing, but there is something in this, because the animals are slain, or the animal, we don't know if it was one or more, was slain. And then, of course, God took these skins and he replaced their man-made covering with this divine covering of beasts. And so that was almost like, teaches almost like the doctrine of imputation, I would say, where you have the righteousness of a substitute is imputed to you, and it's a covering, kafar. It covers your sin, so that God can pass by. He doesn't have to judge you. He doesn't have to, he doesn't have to destroy you. He can actually deal with you on human terms and in a covenantal sense without destroying you, because he's already covered your nakedness. So he can overlook the fact that you're a sinner. Again, this is classic Protestant theology. A lot of people won't buy it, though. They say, well, this is, either they don't believe that, that the early chapters of Genesis teach this, have this germ of the gospel, or they don't believe that, that this is what it teaches. But I can't really, I don't know. I can't see that they're making this up. I think that, if you just sit back and, put your presuppositions or your your prejudice is on the shelf. And if you just sit back and just look at this and see what's being said by, the great theologians of the past who knew their stuff, who knew their Hebrew, their Greek, and their theology, I think you'll agree that there's something more to this than people will readily admit. And so, Lightfoot goes on, he says, observe that Luke 1, verse 70, as he spake by the mouth of his holy prophets, which have been since the world began, hinting that from the very beginning of the world, there were prophets of the Messiah. Thus Adam was a prophet of Christ and prophesied of him in the name of Eve, signifying life. And Eve prophesied of him in the name of Cain. She conceived and bare Cain and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord, or I have begotten a man, the Lord. Remember, if you watched the one that we did last week on the two seeds of Genesis 4 and 5, you'll see I got that from I.M. Haldeman, and I said, I know I've seen this before. I know Bullinger came out with it, but look, we see Lightfoot. He's endorsing the same interpretation. And again, he's a great Hebrew scholar, but he's endorsing the same interpretation in, the 1600s. So, and Lightfoot continues, and in the name of Seth, Genesis chapter 4:25, she bare a son and called his name Seth, for God saith, she hath appointed another seed. So remember, Seth was actually appointed to replace Cain. Of course, it was, it was ostensibly to replace Abel, but he really ended up replacing Cain because Cain had forfeited his birthright. So the promise of the Messiah was not given to a castaway. It was given to Abraham and David and others that were righteous men. Religion began to be planted by Adam. Cain and Abel brought sacrifice to God, which shows that religion had been planted before. So he's going on and he's, getting into this. He's getting more into the details. And he says Christ prevailed against the serpent from the beginning and had a seed. The church began with Adam, else what confusion would there have been in the world? The Sabbath was given from the beginning, and Adam kept it. All God's dealings with him were to forward faith in him. Such were his cursing the ground, his expelling him out of Eden, his enjoining him sacrifice, and the Sabbath. Adam is ranked with the holy ones. Genesis chapter 5. These things laid together may be sufficient to prove that Adam and Eve believed and obtained life. And then he says, well, now let's look at the next place. And view their means of believing. And then, so now he gets what you might say a little bit fanciful. And now he's going to say they're under two covenants. They're under an old covenant and a new. And so, those of us who believe in such a thing as the covenant of works, which I certainly do, and in the covenant of grace, will often trace it back to, early Genesis. For instance, Adam was under a covenant of works. He failed the covenant of works, and so God made with him the covenant of grace. Of course, with the covenant of grace, he slew a sacrifice, an innocent victim, substitute, slain, ratifying this covenant of grace. Because man couldn't be saved if there was no covenant of grace made after the fall. Man couldn't be saved. So there couldn't have been any salvation all the way from from Adam to, whoever you start with with people being saved, whether you start it with Abraham or Moses or whoever. So, you have to at least take a look at that and consider that aspect of it. So he's going to say a new covenant was made with them. They were under two covenants in one day, as Noah saw two worlds. So Adam saw an old creation and a new, and it was said of him, as it was said of him, idem dies vidit consulum et exsulum. The same day saw him consul and a banished man. So the same day saw Adam under two vastly different conditions, according to the tenor of the two covenants. The form of either covenant was not expressed plainly, but resulting the covenant of grace and the covenant of works, both somewhat obscure to him, but the enjoyment of God was necessarily intimated in both, not the enjoyment of the creature. So he's going to go on, and he's going to kind of, just spin his theology here, which is a good sermon. If you have a chance to read it, by all means, do that. But I think these, I really have to say that Genesis 3, if you don't understand Genesis 3 and what's being taught in Genesis 3, it sounds trite and you've probably heard it many times before, but you're not going to understand the rest of the Bible. So I think you even have to take it back to Genesis 1. I think you have to get Genesis 1, 2 right, where the earth became without form and void, and find out, well, that's where there was a fall in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. And that's why the Spirit of God begins to hover over the deep. And then that's where light and darkness are separated. And this is really, as Milton Terry said in one of his books, this is a picture, this is a portrait of redemption, where, you have something, you have a creation, and then you have a fallen creation, and then you have the Spirit of God going to work, and then you have a regeneration and a separation of light from darkness, and you have order brought out of chaos. This is the story of redemption. So this story of redemption, it doesn't just start in the garden. It starts way back in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, where, God created the heavens and the earth, and then the earth became without form and void. And so does this teach old earth? Well, I believe it does. I don't think, personally, I don't know if I would say the earth is, millions of years old. I don't know if I believe that, but I mean, it's surely more, older than 6,000 years. And even secular history, you have secular histories going back before 4004 BC. So like I said, you don't have to be an old earth, and agree with all these dictates of science and the geological ages and all that. I don't think you have to go that far, but it does say in Genesis 1:2 that the earth became without form and void. I think if you see that, you've got pretty much a good template to go forward. And then you can understand the story of the garden a little bit better, because first the creation is thrown out of focus, and then man is created to inherit what I believe the dominion that Satan forfeited in the primal creation. And then Adam, and then Satan, of course, he's envious. So he doesn't like the idea that someone displaced him, that now someone else is going to have a mandate to rule the world and to govern the world for God. And so Satan causes the downfall of man. And then that's when, of course, man is promised the seed of the woman, who will ultimately defeat Satan, bringing mankind back to God, restoring entrance to the garden, from which man was evicted. And then when you get to the very end of the story, after the millennium, that's when the creation itself, when that primal cataclysm that was just temporarily, it was kind of patched up in Genesis chapter 1, where that is finally healed. And now you've got that primal equilibrium between the heavens and the earth, between Hashomayim and Haaretz. You have that equilibrium restored again. So now you don't have that firmament separating the creation from the presence of God. I think that's the way you have to go if you're going to really understand biblical topology. Now, of course, you could take this and you could say, well, this is just a covenant, and this is, like some of the full preterists do. They'll take this and say, well, this is just a story of the covenants. The covenants. It's all about the covenants. And well, the covenants are important, but the covenants are a subset. The covenants are revealed after after the creation is revealed. So the creation is where we exist. It's where we live. It's our frame of reference for really everything we do, for reality. And the covenants come afterwards. The covenants are the result of God condescending to make conditions with man. In the case of Genesis chapter 3, after man fell, after man disobeyed the original covenant, God condescended to make a covenant of grace. And that's, of course, but you have to understand that man was placed in a certain situation. He was placed in an environment, and the story of man's environment comes first. So if you're going to cut that out of the equation and say, well, this is just dealing with the covenants, then I think you're going to have some problems. But again, that's something that you've got to kind of chart yourself, because there's a lot of different views out there. So 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 um so he's going to go on and he's going to say, what comfort then is here to poor sinners? Look, an example of that is St. Paul, who is the chief of sinners, yet grace was most exceeding abundant towards him. He was a blasphemer and a persecutor and injurious. Here were sins like scarlet, yet forgiven. You that are under the pangs of conscience, consider this grace. Thou canst not sin so heinously as Adam did if thou addest not willfulness and impenitency, nor fall so high nor damn posterity as he did, and yet he obtained pardon. Take one example more. There were some pardoned that crucified the second Adam. So he's talking about this is the grace that's been provided in the covenant of grace. And so man was evicted from the garden. He was promised re-entrance at a later date upon the merits of a substitute. That Jesus Christ would be the substitute who would be slain. He would rise from the dead. He would ascend to the right hand of God. He would be expecting till his enemies were made his footstool. And then he would reign for this 1,000 years, filling out the time that Adam, of course, was supposed to reign. He was supposed to exercise dominion, but it was really not a very good dominion. And he only lived for, I think, 930 years. Well, Jesus Christ, the second Adam, he's going to reign for a full 1,000 years. And so governmental righteousness, that's one of the things in some of my debates, I've even talked about that. Governmental righteousness. It's, good government is the one thing that we're all obsessed over. We want good government. Well, you can't have good government if you've got a race of men that are, have good and evil continuously, in a process of struggle, oftentimes with the evil, overpowering the good. You're not going to have a good government like that, which is why all governments ultimately they fall by their own efforts. I mean, and then of course man's evicted from the garden. He's given the promise of re-entrance, but then these two seeds come into focus. Remember, the two seeds are really important because the two seeds, there's going to be one seed that's going to be accepted, and then there's going to be another seed that's going to be rejected. So when we get to, say, doctrines of Israelology, and we look at the Israel's kingdom program in the Old Testament scriptures, and we see that there's this refining motif that goes on. I believe it starts in Isaiah chapter 1, and it goes on. It's seen in Jeremiah, it's seen in Ezekiel, it's seen in Malachi, it's seen where God's going to refine Israel. He's going to put them in the furnace. He's going to purge out all the dross. He's going to purge out the non-elect. And then what's going to be left over is it's going to be the nation is going to be purified from their sin. And so all Israel will be saved is all the mass of the nation, the entire mass of the nation after all the non-elect are purged out. You get that from Zechariah chapter 13. Also from Isaiah chapter 4. But after this salvation, this purging of Israel, that's when the nations are going to be judged. Now, did that happen in AD 70? No, it didn't. In fact, what you had in AD 70 was you had an eviction. You had a casting away of the earthly seed. You had a breaking of Israel on the potter's wheel. Why? So that God could remake Israel, so he could remake a new Israel formed of both Jews and Gentiles. That's what he's doing in this dispensation. But he sent them away, not as not permanently, not as if they were, he sent them into extinction. He sent them away for the purpose of bringing in the Gentiles, so that he could turn to another people, so that he could bring another people into the program, so they too could become sons of God. And then when this program's over, he's going to cut the unfaithful Gentile branches off, and then he's going to regraft Israel in again. So when you finally do have the church being finished, it's going to be, it's going to be it's still going to be a Jewish church, but it's going to be Jewish foundations. It's going to be Gentile building stones, and then it's going to be Jewish gates. So the last thing to be added are really, it's the headstone, but the gates are like the next to last things to be added. So they're going to come in at the very end. I don't know how it's going to happen. I don't know. I don't think that the tribes, that the 12 tribes are, let me just say this. I don't think the lost tribes are, you can really find them anywhere. I think he's going to reconstitute the tribes, much like God reconstituted, say, the 24 courses of priests that returned from Babylonian captivity. There was a great article, I think Lightfoot even mentioned it, that, Zechariah of the course of Abijah, he wasn't really of the course of Abijah. Abijah was not one of the courses that returned. There were only 4 courses that returned. And what they did was they reconstituted that 24 courses out of those people who had returned from the 4 courses. So I think that's the same thing that's going to happen again. I think he's going to reconstitute the nation of Israel. He's going to reconstitute the tribes. From what materials he's going to do that, I don't know, but it's going to happen. I think you're seeing more of an interest now than ever of Judaic, Hebrew based Christianity, which you weren't really seeing 20 years ago. You're starting to see it, but now it's like taken off, where people want to get back to the Jewish roots of Christianity. Now, some of them I think, are going down the wrong path. They're trying to figure this out through like rabbinical sources and stuff, which is fine. You can look at some of that stuff as long as you remember, that the nation was blinded because they didn't repent, and because they didn't fulfill certain conditions. So we want to make very, very clear that we're not endorsing a rabbinical view of messianic, of the doctrine of the Messiah. We're not endorsing rabbinism, but what we're doing is we're saying, wow, look at all these doctrines that are coming out that all have their, messianic Judaism, Hebrew roots, getting back to the original languages. It's really amazing how this stuff is just now coming to the surface, where, the older Gentile forms of Christianity, they're really struggling. They're, all the denominations, all the major denominations are in trouble. If you've taken the pains to notice, they're trying to beef up their denominations again. They're trying to come up with various means of trying to get people interested. They're trying to, rehabilitate their denominations, which is probably the wrong way to do it. You don't want to rehabilitate the sectarianism. You want to kind of get beyond sectarianism. You want to get back to the unity of the faith. But that's what they're doing. And because they can't keep afloat, these denominations, a lot of them have gone liberal. A lot of them have just completely compromised their message. And those are actually losing numbers. The ones that are doing really, really good are the ones that want to take it back to the Jewish roots of Christianity. I've seen it. I've seen people with, on YouTube, Hebrew roots. They're preaching false doctrines. They're preaching people are under law and they've got to, not eat pork and do this and do that. But they've got 50,000 subs. I mean, it's growing. So with that said, I just think it's important that we go back to Genesis and that we get it down. And like I said, you may not agree with all this. You might not agree that there is a gospel in Genesis. You might not agree this has anything with us. But then you go to Genesis 4 and you see that the 2 seeds, you see what happens in Genesis 4 in the end of days. That was an end of days thing that happened with Cain and Abel. And then you go to Genesis 5, you keep going, moving on and on and on. And so what I'm saying is the divine author is trying to tell us something. And it's really, I think it's needful to get back to biblical topology, even if you don't agree, say, everything that Lightfoot prescribes. That said, well, thanks, Steve. I appreciate it, and I appreciate everything that Steve does. Steve came on board, and we had a discussion, and he had a great attitude, probably the best attitude of anybody, that I think I've had on this channel in a long, long time, because he wasn't here to throw stones, and I didn't want to throw stones at him either. I would say, look, I understand full preterism. I understand what makes a lot of people accept full preterism. I'm not blaming anybody for that. I don't think there's, if you believe Christ came back in AD 70 and that's all prophecy is fulfilled. I know the reasons why you believe this. So that's not something I'm arguing with, except to say that I think there's a lot more on the other side of AD 70. That's what I've been contending for many years. I think there is a lot more that we can learn from, even going back to typology, not necessarily even going to New Testament proof texts. Um, you know, like in the lesson I did a couple weeks ago, I said, what's next in prophecy? And I said, I don't want to go to the New Testament and say, well, this is going to happen, that's going to happen. No. I want to go to the Old Testament and I want to look for patterns. I want to say, well, what happened after the 40 years in the wilderness? And does that have any relation to post AD 70 reality? I think that's a smarter way because, like I said, there's people that don't believe in prophecy. I don't mean that pejoratively. I don't mean that insulting or anything like that. It's just there's some people that don't believe prophecy is relevant. They either believe it's all past, or they don't believe it's relevant in any way to us, or they just don't believe it. So we got to get back to something. There has to be. This can't be as good as it's going to get. I don't think anybody who reads the scriptures from Genesis to Revelation with an open mind and with an objective frame of reading it, that's going to really come to the conclusion that, okay, well, AD 70's past and gone, but that's the best it's going to get. No, there's a lot more stuff. I think there's a lot more stuff ahead. Now, I will say this, that when after I left full preterism back in 2007, and I was kind of on the fence for about a year. I didn't know what I was going to, I was kind of like hanging around the Amel partial preterist for people for a little while. And then I said, let me just read, because I was reading through the prophets, and I came to Jeremiah and I said, let me just read Jeremiah like I would read any other book. No presuppositions, just, read Jeremiah, because that was one of the prophets that not a lot of people quoted. And so I read Jeremiah. And by the time I got through, I was like, there's no way that these prophecies can have been spiritually fulfilled in the church. There's just no way. You can't make that apply to the spiritual fulfillment of the church. This is talking about a restoration of Jewish people. This is talking about a judgment of the nations. There's just no way. So that was one of the views. I think that was one of the moments that actually pushed me to start investigating, the historic side of Christianity, start getting into the church fathers and stuff, and just start seeing, what they were teaching. Because, like I said, I didn't, I became a preterist like a year into my being, a Christian. I started off with preterism. I didn't, wasn't raised in dispensational environment. I was like within a year of me being a Christian, I was endorsing preterism. So I didn't hear about historic Christianity. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know anything about premillennialism. I didn't know anything about these other doctrines. I had heard the rapture being preached, but I didn't believe it because I couldn't find it in the scriptures. I couldn't find the pre-tribulation rapture in the scriptures. So, it took a long time, but eventually I see that, there's a plan that God's giving, and it's a plan for humanity. It's a plan for the creation. It's good news is what it is, what I'm saying. It's not bad news like we have to deal with sorrow and sickness and dying and all that forever. There is good news at the end. It really is a story that has a happy ending. Anyways, that's going to be it for tonight. I just wanted to do this. Like I said, I do have a debate coming up. It's going to be next month. I won't release the details yet until it's gone public, until it's been posted on Donnie's channel, but should be good. Until then, I'm going to probably try doing a couple of these and might try to do another discussion. So if you have any discussion ideas, thank you, Steve. I really appreciate it. $4.99 super chat. Really appreciate it, buddy. And we're going to have another discussion soon. Hopefully we could do a part 2 on the Jeremy discussion with Jeremy and yourself. And we can continue that discussion, because that was a great discussion. I really appreciate it. But I will be back and I'll weigh in with some of y'all via email. if not Facebook. And we'll talk about maybe having another discussion during the next few weeks. Until then, hope everybody has a great rest of your week. Stay safe, and we'll talk soon.